Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, the American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on sharecropping, racial terror, and the rise of Jim Crow. The core question is this: what happens when constitutional amendments survive on paper, while debt, terror, and judicial narrowing take control on the ground? The core competency is to describe the social, political, and economic advancements made and setbacks faced by freedmen in the Jim Crow South.
What happens when constitutional amendments survive on paper while debt, terror, and judicial narrowing take control on the ground? The end of Reconstruction did not come as one clean event. It came through linked systems that reduced the force of emancipation and the Reconstruction amendments while leaving those formal gains on the page. White supremacy returned through debt, contract law, political violence, judicial narrowing, and national retreat. The people building that return did not call it counter-revolution in their own public language. They called it redemption, home rule, honest government, or restored order. The underlying work, however, was the same: to strip black citizens and their allies of the political, economic, and institutional power they had gained during Reconstruction. This final phase is decisive because it shows what rights require beyond constitutional text. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments remained in force, and black communities still possessed churches, schools, and family networks built during Reconstruction. Yet those achievements could be weakened when the economy of cotton tied labor to debt, when armed organizations broke elections, when courts cut back federal reach, and when national politicians accepted a settlement that left local democracy exposed. Jim Crow grew out of those linked decisions, and that growth can be followed in ledgers, massacres, campaign tactics, and court opinions. The transition also explains why the history after emancipation cannot be taught as a simple line from freedom to progress. Some gains endured, others were contained, narrowed, or violently attacked. The South that emerged after Reconstruction was not slavery continued unchanged, though it was also far from the biracial republic that radical Republicans and black office holders had briefly tried to build. It was a new order shaped by old hierarchies adapted to new law. Land sat at the center of the problem. Most freed people did not receive the property that would have made independent farming possible because Johnson restored much confiscated land to pardoned owners, and Congress never enacted a wide redistribution program. Planters retained acreage, livestock, and much of the local credit structure. Freed people possessed labor, family organization, and some mobility, yet they had to survive in rural systems where merchants and landlords controlled seed, tools, housing, and access to markets. Sharecropping emerged from that imbalance. A family farmed a tract of land and paid the landlord with a share of the crop, often 1/3 or 1/2, depending on which party supplied mules, plows, seed, or food advances. Compared with gang labor, the system gave households more daily control and allowed family members to work together under their own domestic authority. That gain was real. It did not equal independence because the family remained tied to land it did not own, and to a settlement process it did not control fully. The cropland system tightened that dependence. Merchants advanced bacon, cloth, seed, shoes, tools, and other necessities against the future crop. In return, they received a lien on the harvest, often at high interest and under state laws that favored creditor recovery. Cotton dominated these arrangements because creditors preferred a crop they knew how to market and seize. Diversification into food crops could improve household security, yet lien rules and planter pressure often pushed families back toward cotton. The ledger therefore became a governing document. A disputed account or low market year could carry debt into the next season and narrow future choice before planting even began. Poor white farmers could also be trapped by this structure, though free people entered it from a weaker starting position because they had fewer assets, less access to favorable credit, and less confidence in local courts. The system did not recreate slavery's ownership of persons. It did recreate a pattern in which labor, crop choice, and political independence were constrained by people who controlled land and credit. Reconstruction's economic settlement thus left black citizenship resting on a fragile material base. The bookkeeping itself deserves attention. Settlement at the end of a season often depended on a merchant's account books, prices set far away, and calculations the farmer could not easily challenge. A difference in weighing cotton, counting interest, or pricing supplies could alter the result enough to keep a household in debt for another year. The ledger therefore worked as a quiet instrument of rule. It converted uncertainty into leverage and made legal freedom easier to contain through numbers rather than whips. Economic weakness alone did not destroy Reconstruction. Organized violence did equally essential work. The Ku Klux Klan began in Tennessee in 1866 and spread through parts of the South as a clandestine force that whipped teachers, murdered local leaders, raided homes, and terrorized voters. Other groups adopted more public forms. The White League in Louisiana and the Red Shirts in Mississippi and the Carolinas operated openly as armed auxiliaries for white democratic politics. Their targets reveal their purpose. They attacked ministers, school teachers, registrars, legislators, and ordinary voters because those people anchored the institutions and electoral coalitions of Reconstruction. Congress responded with the Enforcement Acts of 1870 and 1871, including the Ku Klux Klan Act, which expanded federal supervision of elections, permitted prosecution of conspiracies against civil rights, and allowed presidential use of extraordinary measures in disturbed areas. Ulysses S. Grant used federal power against the Klan in South Carolina, and the government won convictions in some places. This response shows that the national state still possessed tools to defend Reconstruction when it chose to deploy them. It also shows how demanding that defense was. Troops, prosecutors, witnesses, judges, and appropriations all had to align, and Northern voters had to keep supporting the cost and controversy. Violence remained effective because it operated alongside local politics rather than outside it. In Louisiana, the Colfax Massacre of 1873 followed a disputed election and ended with the slaughter of black defenders after a courthouse struggle. In Mississippi, the Mississippi Plan of 1875 combined intimidation, economic retaliation, and armed pressure to suppress Republican turnout and split coalitions. Similar methods appeared in South Carolina and elsewhere. Election seasons became campaigns of organized coercion. A schoolhouse could be burned, a minister threatened, a sharecropper evicted, and a polling place surrounded, all as parts of one political strategy. The Coshada killings in Louisiana during 1874 and the Hamburg Massacre in South Carolina during 1876 show the same pattern in another register. White paramilitaries did not wait for private grudges or spontaneous riots. They selected black leaders, office holders, and militia members whose removal would weaken Republican organization in a parish or county. Violence was coordinated with electoral timing, newspaper agitation, and Democratic campaign goals. Counter-revolution was therefore logistical as well as ideological. These attacks worked against institutions built from below. A family already trapped by debt could be pushed further toward silence if voting risked eviction. A teacher already struggling for supplies could abandon a district if threats became constant. A local office holder could lose both position and life if federal support weakened. Counter-revolution succeeded not because communities had failed to build anything, but because opponents understood exactly which institutions had to be broken for black citizenship to contract. Judicial retreat helped complete that contraction. The slaughterhouse cases of 1873 narrowed the reach of the 14th Amendment's privileges or immunities clause, signaling that many rights claims would remain largely in state hands. The United States versus Cruikshank in 1876, arising from the Colfax violence, further limited federal capacity to punish private conspiracies under the Enforcement Acts. The decision treated many protections as restraints on national government rather than as broad sources of federal authority against local terror. A massacre tied to political rights thus produced a precedent that made national protection harder. The disputed presidential election of 1876 accelerated the political side of the retreat. Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden each claimed victory, and bargaining over contested electoral returns created space for a settlement later labeled the Compromise of 1877, a loose set of understandings whose outcome was clear enough because federal troops left the remaining reconstructed governments in Louisiana and South Carolina while national commitment to further Southern enforcement weakened. Redeemer Democrats then consolidated control in states where violence and electoral manipulation had already done much of the work. Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 stands at the legal end of that sequence. The court accepted Louisiana's segregation law and treated separate but equal accommodations as constitutionally tolerable. The decision did not invent racial hierarchy from nothing. It gave national judicial sanction to patterns already built through debt, disfranchisement, intimidation, and political abandonment. That is why Plessy belongs in a Reconstruction lecture. It is the late legal ratification of an order assembled during Reconstruction's retreat. The opinion also shaped public memory. If segregation could be described as lawful reason rather than as constitutional betrayal, then the overthrow of Reconstruction could be redescribed as the restoration of order. Lost cause storytelling, redeemer politics, and commemorative culture extended that reinterpretation into schools, monuments, newspapers, and speeches. Law and memory worked together, each making the other easier to sustain. Federal retreat after 1877 also affected public finance and administration. When Redeemer governments gained control, they could redirect school funds, alter militia policy, and narrow the administrative reach of the state where black participation had recently expanded it. That meant the fall of Reconstruction did not occur only at the level of national elections or Supreme Court doctrine. It also appeared in county budgets, school terms, jury service, and the willingness of sheriffs to protect one group of citizens rather than another. Redeemer governments claimed they were rescuing the South from corruption, taxation, and outside rule. In practice, they restored white Democratic dominance, reduced support for Republican institutions, and narrowed black access to political power. Public schools continued, though, under unequal funding and segregated assumptions that hardened across the 1880s and 1890s. Convict leasing expanded in several states, using criminal law to extract labor from disproportionately black defendants. Segregation deepened in transport, public accommodations, and local custom before full statutory systems took shape. The social order that later generations would call Jim Crow was being assembled through county law, state politics, labor relations, and court decisions. The achievements of Reconstruction were not erased completely. Black churches endured, schools survived in many places, families remained legally recognized, and the Reconstruction Amendment stayed available for later generations to invoke. Yet the daily balance of power had shifted strongly. A right that remains in the Constitution can still be hollowed out if enforcement fails, if local violence goes unchecked, and if economic structures keep vulnerable citizens dependent on those who oppose their full equality. That is why the rise of Jim Crow must be treated as a sequence of institutional victories for white supremacy rather than as a mood change after the war. Creditors won leverage over labor, armed Democrats won control over elections, courts won the power to narrow federal remedies, and Redeemer politicians won the authority to govern the post-Reconstruction South. Each victory fed the next. Once those pieces aligned, segregation and disfranchisement looked to later generations like established order instead of recent construction. The historical lesson is procedural and moral at once. Reconstruction did not collapse because freedom lacked legal language. It collapsed because law, administration, politics, and economy separated under pressure. So sharecropping narrowed independence, paramilitary violence narrowed participation, courts narrowed federal reach, and national politicians accepted retreat before equal citizenship was secure. Jim Crow followed from that chain. It was built, defended, and later normalized, and the mechanisms of that building can be named precisely. Convict leasing sharpened that conclusion in several states after redemption. Black men arrested under harsh local policing could be leased to private employers or state-connected enterprises, turning criminal law into another labor system that thrived after formal slavery had ended. This development belongs in the same story as crop liens and segregation statutes because it shows how post-Reconstruction governments kept searching for legal and administrative ways to extract labor while denying equal protection in practice. Debt, violence, judicial narrowing, and political retreat built a new regime while the Reconstruction Amendment still stood in constitutional text. The harder judgment is what rights mean when they survive on paper after enforcement, land access, and physical security have been abandoned. Jim Crow was not the weather. It was the result of decisions that left no easy innocence for the governments that permitted it.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.